The courtroom was silent as the judge entered, his robes flowing and his face calm yet commanding. All eyes turned toward him. The two officers seated at the defense table looked up casually at first, their arrogance evident in their postures. But within seconds, their expressions shifted. One leaned forward, squinting as if his mind couldn't accept what his eyes saw. The other froze, his face draining of color. It was him, the black man they had arrested just days earlier, treating him with disdain and cruelty. The man they had mocked and belittled, calling him unfit to walk free in their town. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was their judge. The tension was suffocating, and every single person in the courtroom could feel it. The judge, however, didn't flinch. He calmly set his gavel down, his eyes briefly locking onto the officers. There was no anger, no outward sign of vengeance in his expression, just an icy professionalism that carried far more weight than any outburst could. "We'll now proceed," he said, his voice steady. The officer's attorney stammered, his confidence faltering. "And the cops themselves?" One of them whispered something to the other, who shook his head, panicked. They were realizing that the man whose rights they had violated wasn't just another person they could mistreat. He held the power to decide their fate, and now they had to face him on equal terms, or perhaps far less than equal. The judge tapped his gavel lightly to bring order, but the room was already on edge. And as the trial began, everyone wondered, how had this come to pass? How had these officers brought themselves to such a disastrous moment? The story behind it all was just as shocking. It all began 2 weeks earlier on a quiet evening in a suburban neighborhood. Judge Michael Reed, a man of immense integrity and known for his fairness, had left his home to pick Pao, his nephew, from basketball practice. He was dressed casually, jeans, sneakers, and a simple hoodie. Nothing about his attire hinted at his status. He was just another man walking through his community. As he reached the corner where the basketball court stood, flashing lights appeared behind him. He turned to see a patrol car, its sirens blaring unnecessarily. 2 officers stepped out, their movements sharp and calculated. Hands where I can see them," one barked. Michael frowned but complied. "What's going on, officers?" he asked calmly. "Don't play smart," the taller cop sneered. "We got a call about someone matching your description. Suspicious activity." Michael kept his composure, though frustration simmered beneath the surface. "Suspicious activity? I'm just walking to pick up my nephew." The shorter officer scoffed. "Likely story. Turn around and face the car." "What exactly am I being accused of?" Michael asked, his tone firm but polite. "Resisting, if you don't shut your mouth," the taller officer snapped. The humiliation mounted as they patted him down roughly, ignoring his repeated attempts to explain himself. A small group of bystanders gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some recognized Michael, but they were too afraid to speak up. Michael was handcuffed and placed in the back of the patrol car, his mind racing. He knew he could defuse the situation by revealing who he was, but something held him back. Perhaps it was a need to understand how far they would go. Perhaps it was the principle of the matter, that he shouldn't need to declare his status to be treated with basic decency. At the station, the officers continued their treatment, mocking him as they processed his paperwork. "Bet you've got a rap sheet a mile long," one sneered. Michael said nothing, his silence unnerving them. After hours of unnecessary detainment, he was finally allowed to call his lawyer, who arrived in record time. The officers' smugness wavered as they overheard parts of the conversation, but they still didn't realize the magnitude of their mistake. By the next morning, Michael was released, but the damage had been done. And now, as the trial began, the officers' actions were under scrutiny, not just from the court, but from the public, who had learned of the incident through media coverage. As the first witness was called, The officers exchanged desperate glances. They knew this wasn't just about them anymore. This was about a system that allowed people like them to operate unchecked. Judge Reed sat on the bench, listening intently. His expression remained neutral, but his presence was a reminder of the power of accountability. The courtroom braced for what was to come next. The courtroom was tense, the air heavy with anticipation. Officer Daniels, the taller and more aggressive of the two, sat stiffly at the defense table, his usual bravado replaced by nervous energy. His partner, Officer Green, fidgeted with his pen, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. They had never imagined they'd be sitting here, facing judgment for the very kind of abuse they had long dismissed as routine. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa Monroe, rose to deliver her opening statement. She spoke with a fiery conviction, laying out the case against the officers. "This is not just about an unjust arrest," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "This is about a blatant abuse of power, fueled by prejudice, that targeted an innocent man. A man who, as fate would have it, holds the very position they should fear the most. Judge." The words landed like a bomb in the room. The gallery buzzed with whispers, and the officer's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Meanwhile, Judge Reed sat unmoving, his face unreadable as he listened to the case unfold. The story rewound to the night of the arrest. Witnesses were called to testify about what they had seen, neighbors who had watched in horror as Misha L. Reed, a man they knew as kind and respectful, was treated like a criminal. "I saw the whole thing," said Mrs. Caldwell, an elderly woman who lived on the same street. Her voice trembled slightly, but her resolve was strong. "He wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking down the street. But those officers, they didn't care. They treated him like a threat, like he didn't belong." The defense attorney tried to dismiss her testimony as speculation, but the damage was already done. The jury could see the pain in her eyes, the disbelief that such an injustice could happen right in front of her home. Then it was Michael's turn to testify. The courtroom fell silent as he rose from his seat and approached the stand. His presence was commanding, his every movement deliberate. He swore the oath with a steady voice, then turned to face the jury. "I've spent my career upholding the law," he began, his tone calm but firm. "I've dedicated my life to ensuring justice is served fairly, regardless of a person's background. But on that night, none of that mattered. To them, I wasn't a judge. I wasn't even a man. I was just a target." His words hung in the air, each one landing like a hammer blow. The jury's expressions ranged from shock to anger, and even some of the officers' supporters in the gallery looked uneasy. As Michael recounted the events of that night, his voice wavered slightly, but his resolve never faltered. He described the humiliation of being handcuffed, the mocking comments, the disregard for his dignity. And through it all, he kept his focus on the officers at the defense table. "They didn't care who I was or what I had done with my life," he said. "All they saw was my skin color, and that was enough for them to assume the worst." The courtroom was silent, save for the faint scratching of pens as journalists hurried to capture his every word. But just as the prosecution's case seemed airtight, the defense attorney rose with a smug grin. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the presiding judge, "I would like to call into question the objectivity of this case. After all, the alleged victim is the very judge presiding over this trial." The gallery erupted in murmurs, and even the jury looked startled. Michael remained calm, though his jaw tightened slightly. Judge Reed raised a hand to quiet the room. "The prosecution and defense have both agreed to my impartiality in this matter," he said firmly, "and I intend to conduct this trial with fairness and integrity, as I always have." The defense attorney nodded, but the smugness didn't leave his face. "Even so, Your Honor, I believe this situation warrants closer scrutiny. My clients acted within their training and the law. Michael's gaze hardened, but he said nothing. The tension in the room was palpable. Then Lisa Monroe stood again, her eyes blazing. "Training and the law," she repeated, her voice sharp. "Let's talk about their training. Let's talk about how they ignored every protocol, how they escalated a peaceful situation into an unnecessary arrest. Let's talk about how they abused the very authority entrusted to them." The defense attorney opened his mouth to object, but Lisa cut him off. "And let's not forget," she continued, her voice rising, "the man they wronged isn't just a victim. He's a symbol of what this system should stand for: justice." The room was electric with emotion, the weight of her words sinking into everyone present. The defense attorney looked rattled, his earlier confidence shaken. As the day's proceedings came to a close, the courtroom was left in suspense. The jury exchanged glances, their faces etched with uncertainty. The officers avoided eye contact with everyone, their earlier arrogance replaced by visible fear. And Judge Reed? He sat quietly, his expression unreadable, as though weighing the scales of justice in his mind. The trial was far from over, but one thing was clear: the truth was coming, and it wouldn't be stopped. The courtroom doors creaked open the next morning, revealing a packed gallery. News of the trial had spread like wildfire, and every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras poised to capture every moment. The tension was thicker than ever, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Michael Reed sat at the bench, his calm demeanor masking the storm within. Across the room, Officers Daniels and Green exchanged nervous whispers, their earlier smugness replaced by visible anxiety. They knew the evidence against them was mounting, but their lawyer was banking on a last-ditch strategy to turn the tide. The proceedings began with Lisa Monroe calling an expert witness, a police training specialist. The man, a grizzled veteran with decades of experience, took the stand and was sworn in. "Mr. Collins," Lisa began, "can you describe the standard protocol for approaching someone on suspicion of a crime?" Collins adjusted his glasses and nodded. "Yes, officers are trained to assess the situation calmly, de-escalate if necessary, and gather evidence before making any assumptions or arrests." "And in your review of this case," Lisa continued, her tone sharp, "did Officers Daniels and Green follow this protocol?" Collins hesitated, his expression grim. "No," he said finally. "They did not." The gallery murmured, the sound like a ripple of thunder. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. That's speculative." Judge Reed raised a hand. "Overruled. The witness is providing expert testimony based on the evidence presented." Lisa pressed on. "Mr. Collins, can you elaborate?" Collins nodded. "From the body cam footage, it's clear the office years escalated the situation unnecessarily. They ignored basic principles of de-escalation and acted based on bias rather than facts." Lisa stepped closer to the jury, her voice ringing with conviction. "Bias. That's the heart of this case, isn't it? These officers didn't see a man walking down the street. They saw a threat. They saw a stereotype. And they acted on it, with no regard for justice or protocol." The jury's faces were grim, their expressions unreadable, but attentive. Meanwhile, Daniels and Green sat frozen, their lawyer whispering furiously to them. Then it was the defense's turn. Their lawyer, a slick man named Richard Kane, rose from his seat with an air of practiced confidence. He approached the stand, his voice calm and measured. "Mr. Collins," he began, "you've reviewed many cases of alleged misconduct, correct?" "Yes," Collins replied. "And in your professional opinion, is it possible for officers to make mistakes under pressure without malicious intent?" Collins hesitated. "It's possible, but—" Kane cut him off. "Thank you. No further questions." Lisa stood immediately, her expression fiery. Redirect, Your Honor. Judge Reed nodded, and Lisa turned back to Collins. Mr. Collins, let's clarify something. When officers make mistakes under pressure, are they still accountable for the consequences of their actions? Collins didn't hesitate this time. Yes, absolutely. Lisa's gaze swept over the jury. Accountability. That's what this trial is about. Not excuses, not justifications. Accountability. The defense's smugness wavered, and a flicker of doubt crossed Kane's face. But the day wasn't over yet. Lisa had saved her most damning evidence for last, the body cam footage. The lights dimmed as the footage was played on a screen for the entire courtroom to see. The video began with Daniels and Green sitting in their patrol car, their conversation laced with casual disdain. Another one, Daniels muttered as Michael walked past. Bet he's up to no good. The gallery gasped, and Kane's face went pale. Lisa didn't say a word, letting the footage speak for itself. The video continued, showing the officers confronting Michael, their tone aggressive from the start. Michael's calm and measured responses only seemed to irritate them further. Don't get smart with us, Green snapped in the footage, pushing Michael against a wall. You people think you can do whatever you want. The gasps grew louder, and someone in the gallery muttered, Unbelievable. The footage ended with Michael being handcuffed, his protests ignored. The room was silent, the weight of what they had just seen hanging heavily in the air. Lisa broke the silence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is what systemic bias looks like. This is what abuse of power looks like, and this is what we must hold accountable. The jury's expressions were a mixture of shock and anger. Even Judge Reed's calm demeanor had cracked, his jaw tight as he signaled for a recess. As the courtroom emptied, Daniels and Green sat frozen, their faces pale. For the first time, they seemed to grasp the gravity of their situation. But outside the courtroom, the storm was only beginning. Protesters had gathered, their chants echoing through the streets. Justice for Michael Reed, they cried, their voices rising like a tidal wave. Inside, Michael sat alone in his chambers, staring at the body cam footage paused on his laptop. The image of himself, handcuffed and humiliated, burned in his mind. He knew this trial was about more than just him. It was about every person who had been wronged by a broken system. He closed the laptop and took a deep breath. The fight was far from over, but he was ready. The next day in court began with a heavy silence. The tension was palpable, a tangible weight pressing on everyone in the room. Officers Daniels and Green sat at the defense table, their arrogant demeanor replaced with a nervous rigidity. Across from them, Michael Reed entered the courtroom with the same composed but resolute expression he had carried throughout the trial. The gallery was even more crowded than the day before. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, and the faint hum of cameras clicking filled the air. Outside, the chants of protesters could still be heard, their determination undiminished. Lisa Monroe stood, her stance firm and commanding. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call its next witness, Officer Daniels. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The defense lawyer, Richard Kane, stood abruptly. Objection. My client is not obligated to testify. Judge Reed raised an eyebrow. Ms. Monroe, do you have grounds? Lisa nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Officer Daniels previously provided a statement to Internal Affairs. I would like to question him about it. Judge Reed considered for a moment before nodding. Objection overruled. Officer Daniels, take the stand. Daniels hesitated, glancing at his lawyer, but Kane gave him a stiff nod. Slowly, Daniels rose and made his way to the witness stand, his movements heavy with reluctance. After being sworn in, Daniels sat stiffly, his hands gripping the edges of the stand. Lisa wasted no time. Officer Daniels, she began, her voice calm but sharp. In your statement to Internal Affairs, you claimed you approached Mr. Reed because he fit the description of a suspect. Is that correct? Daniels nodded, his jaw clenched. Yes. Lisa walked slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. And what exactly was that description? Daniels shifted uncomfortably. A black male wearing a dark jacket. Lisa stopped and turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. So, by that description, any black man in a dark jacket could be considered a suspect. Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. The gallery murmured, and Kane looked visibly uneasy. Lisa pressed on. Officer Daniels, did you at any point verify Mr. Reed's identity before arresting him? Daniels hesitated. We didn't have time. No time, Lisa repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. She turned to the jury, her voice rising. No time to verify his identity. No time to check his credentials, but plenty of time to assume, to judge, and to humiliate. The murmurs grew louder, and Judge Reed banged his gavel. Order in the court. Lisa faced Daniels again. One more question, Officer Daniels. Were you aware, at any point during your interaction with Mr. Reed, that he was the state's chief judge? Daniels' face turned ashen. No. Lisa nodded, her expression cold. No further questions. The defense attorney scrambled to redirect, but Daniels' credibility had already crumbled. The damage was done. As the day went on, more witnesses were called, including community members who had been subjected to similar treatment by the two officers. Each testimony added another layer to the picture of systemic bias and abuse of power. But the most explosive moment came at the end of the day, when Lisa introduced a final piece of evidence. A private recording obtained from the police precinct. The recording captured Daniels and Green speaking candidly about their arrest of Michael. Can you believe it? Green's voice said, a mocking tone clear in the recording. The guy actually thought he could talk his way out of it. Daniels laughed. They always do. Just another cocky. He used a racial slur that sent a collective gasp through the courtroom. The defense lawyer jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is inadmissible. Judge Reed's voice cut through the room like a blade. Overruled. Play the full recording. The gallery was deathly silent as the recording continued, exposing the officer's blatant prejudice and mockery. When it ended, the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Judge Reed dismissed the court for the day, but the atmosphere was electric-ish. As people filed out, whispers of outrage and determination filled the air. Outside, the crowd of protesters erupted into cheers as the news of the recording spread. Inside his chambers, Michael sat at his desk, his hands steepled as he stared at the files before him. The truth was out, but the fight wasn't over. He knew the defense would attempt every trick in the book to sway the jury. But he also knew that justice was closer than ever. As he prepared for the next day, a knock came at his door. It was Lisa. We've got them cornered, she said, her voice fierce. But they're going to come out swinging. Michael nodded. Let them. We're ready. The courtroom was packed again the next morning. The air was thick with anticipation, each person seated at the edge of their chair, waiting for the final battle to unfold. Reporters whispered in hushed tones, their pens poised over notepads. Outside, the crowd had nearly doubled, their chants of justice for all echoing through the courthouse walls. Michael Reed walked into the courtroom with calm authority, his judge's robe flowing behind him. His face betrayed no emotion, but his sharp gaze suggested he was more determined than ever to see this case through. He took his place at the bench, the gavel in his hand, a symbol of the justice system he had sworn to uphold. As the trial resumed, the defense lawyer, Richard Kane, stood with a newfound aggressiveness. He was visibly rattled by the recording from the previous day, but he tried to mask his desperation with bluster. "Your Honor," Kane began, his voice loud and forceful. "The recording presented yesterday was taken out of context. My clients may have made unprofessional remarks, but this does not prove intent to discriminate." Lisa Monroe stood in response, her tone steady and unwavering. "Your Honor, the recording does more than expose unprofessional behavior. It reveals a clear bias that directly influenced the officer's actions against Mr. Reed and countless others." Judge Reed motioned for silence, his gaze steady. "Ms. M. Monroe, proceed." Lisa approached the jury with a series of photos in her hand. "These images," she began, holding up mugshots of black men, "are all individuals arrested by Officers Daniels and Green over the past year. Each one shares a common thread, a lack of evidence tying them to any crime." She turned to the jury, her voice rising. "This isn't just about one incident. This is about a pattern of targeting individuals based solely on the color of their skin. And when Mr. Reed, a judge sworn to uphold the law, was subjected to this same treatment, it became clear that no one is safe from their bias." The jury members exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of her words sinking in. Kane quickly stood, attempting to deflect. "Your Honor, the prosecution is trying to paint a narrative that goes beyond the scope of this case. My client's actions were based on reasonable suspicion." Lisa didn't back down. "Reasonable suspicion," she repeated, her voice sharp. "When no evidence was gathered, no questions were asked, and no identification was verified, that's not reasonable suspicion, that's prejudice." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Judge Reed raised his gavel, silencing the crowd. He nodded for Lisa to continue. "The prosecution would like to call its final witness," Lisa announced. "Officer Green." The room tensed as Green was summoned to the stand. Unlike Daniels, Green looked visibly shaken. His hands trembled as he was sworn in, and sweat glistened on his brow. Lisa wasted no time. "Officer Green, do you believe the actions you and Officer Daniels took against Mr. Reed were justified?" Green hesitated, his eyes darting to Daniels, who sat stone-faced at the defense table. I thought we were following protocol." Lisa stepped closer, her voice soft but piercing. "Protocol? Does protocol involve mocking a man behind his back? Does protocol include making racial slurs?" Green's shoulders sagged. "No," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Lisa pressed on. "Then why did you do it?" Green glanced at Kane, who gave him a warning look, but the pressure was too much. Green broke down, his words spilling out in a rush. "Because it's how things are done," he cried. "It's what we've been taught, to profile, to assume. I didn't think it would go this far." The courtroom erupted in gasps, and Judge Reed slammed his gavel. "Order!" Green buried his face in his hands, his guilt laid bare for everyone to see. The jury stared at him in shock, the weight of his confession hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Lisa turned to the jury, her voice filled with righteous determination. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the truth. This is the system we're fighting to change. And today, you have the power to make a difference." As Lisa returned to her seat, Michael watched her with a quiet sense of pride. She had exposed the ugly truth, and now it was up to the jury to decide. The closing arguments were delivered, the defense scrambling to salvage their case, while Lisa drove her points home with precision. When it was all over, the jury was dismissed to deliberate, and the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Hours passed, each minute stretching endlessly. The crowd outside grew louder, their chants echoing through the halls. Inside, Michael sat at his desk, his fingers steepled as he waited for the jury's decision. Finally, the bailiff entered. "The jury has reached a verdict," The courtroom filled once more, everyone holding their breath as the foreman stood. We, the jury, find the defendants, Officers Daniels and Green, guilty on all charges. The gallery erupted in cheers, tears streaming down faces as justice was finally served. Outside, the crowd roared with triumph, their chants of victory ringing out. Michael Reed stood, his voice steady as he addressed the court. Justice has been served today, but our work is far from over. Let this be a reminder, that no one is above the law and no one is beneath it. As the courtroom emptied, Michael stepped outside to address the crowd. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but he focused on the people, the ones who had fought for justice alongside him. Today, we made history, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. But tomorrow, we keep fighting, together. Don't forget to like, follow, and share for more stories that inspire and challenge.